All right, get ready for a deep dive into a case that's both fascinating and incredibly disturbing, the Storyville Slayer.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that really gets under your skin.
It sure does. From 1991 to 1996, this case had New Orleans on edge, leaving a trail of victims and a mystery that's, well, still largely unsolved.
I think what makes this case so compelling is that it really highlights the challenges investigators face when dealing with a serial killer who targets vulnerable populations, especially when the methods they use make identification and evidence collection so difficult.
Exactly. And, we're working with excerpts from the Storyville Slayer Wikipedia article for this deep dive, which gives us a pretty good overview.
It's a solid starting point.
Yeah, it is. But what we're going to do today is really try to unpack those nuances, those details, the suspects, the evidence or lack thereof, really get into the weeds of it all.
Because this case, despite all the attention it's received, it's amazing how many of these murders remain officially unsolved.
It's crazy, right? Okay, so let's set the stage for our listeners. The Storyville Slayer was active in New Orleans, primarily targeting African American women, many of whom were involved in sex work.
Right, and their ages range from 17 to 42, which is pretty wide span.
Yeah, it is. And tragically, some of these victims, they still remain unidentified to this day.
That's right. And that speaks to the challenges of investigating crimes against marginalized communities. You see, these women were often living on the edges of society, less likely to report crimes, making it that much harder for investigators to gather information.
It's really just heartbreaking to think about the families not knowing what happened to their loved ones.
It adds a whole other layer of tragedy to an already horrific situation.
It really does. The brutality of the murders is it's chilling. Strangulation seems to have been the preferred method, often accompanied by beatings. And then the killer would dispose of the bodies in isolated waterways, like around Lake Pontchartrain.
And that body disposal method, that's a crucial element here. The prolonged exposure to water, especially in a humid climate like New Orleans, it accelerates decomposition, destroys potential DNA evidence.
Yeah, making it almost impossible to identify some of the victims.
Exactly.
And that's where this case takes a really dark turn. Let's talk about the killer's modus operandi. For the most part, it was consistent, right? Targeting a specific demographic using strangulation and those similar disposal locations. But then we have cases like Danielle Britton, a 17-year-old girl, that don't quite fit the mold.
Danielle's case is a real head-scratcher. Unlike many of the other victims, she had no known connection to sex work.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if maybe the killer's motives were changing or if
Or
perhaps
we're dealing with multiple perpetrators.
it's like a puzzle with some pieces missing. And the timeline adds another layer of complexity. Around 1994, the frequency of the murders seems to escalate, which eventually led to the formation of a dedicated task force in May 1995.
Right, you can imagine the pressure that was mounting on law enforcement at that point. The task force involved the New Orleans Police Department, surrounding parishes. They even brought in the FBI.
Yeah, it was a huge undertaking, and this is where things get really interesting. One of the prime suspects, get this, was Victor Gant, a New Orleans police officer.
Having a police officer as a suspect, that's always a game changer. It just throws a wrench into the whole investigation.
Doesn't it? I mean, think about it. Gant, he was familiar with the red light districts. There were those accusations of corruption and racketeering against him. And to top it all off,
And let's not forget,
he was in an intimate relationship with one of the victims, Sharon Robinson.
that connection to a victim, it definitely puts him in the spotlight.
And it gets even weirder. Gant actually fit the initial suspect description given by one of the early victims, a woman known as Brenda. She described her attacker as, well, a muscular, well-dressed, middle-aged black male driving a dark-colored car.
It's almost too perfect, isn't it?
It really is. And to make matters even more complicated, investigators actually found DNA evidence on a piece of chewing tobacco near one of the victims, but the results, they came back inconclusive.
DNA technology back then wasn't what it is today, so an inconclusive result wouldn't necessarily clear him.
Right, it just adds to the ambiguity. Gaunt was eventually dismissed from the force, but then he appealed the decision and won, getting reinstated with back pay.
That just adds fuel to the fire, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He later moved to Atlanta, but his name, it's never been completely cleared from the suspect list.
There's always that lingering suspicion, isn't there?
Always. But Gaunt wasn't the only one on the radar. We also have suspect number 2, Russell Elwood. Now, Elwood, he was a drug-addicted drifter with a history of petty crime, so a very different profile from Gaunt, the police officer.
It's almost like we're looking at two completely different worlds colliding.
It is, isn't it? Elwood's behavior was, well, let's just say it raised some eyebrows. He was spotted near some of the crime scenes and gave inconsistent explanations when questioned by the police.
Those inconsistencies are always red flags for investigators. They suggest that someone might be trying to hide something.
And get this, some of his fellow inmates claim he actually confessed to them, describing the murders in detail.
Jailhouse confessions can be tricky, but they can also be incredibly valuable.
Especially if they contain details that only the killer would know.
Exactly. And then we have that bizarre Clay call to the Howard Stern show.
Oh, yeah, the one where a caller claiming to be the Storyville Slayer described details of the murders live on the air. That's just creepy.
It's a really strange and unsettling element to this case.
To make things even more confusing, Elwood also gave conflicting confessions to investigators, further muddying the waters.
Yeah, those conflicting statements really make it difficult to separate fact from fiction.
It's like he's playing a game with them, you know? So we have Victor Gant, the police officer with a connection to one of the victims and a lot of suspicious circumstances. And then we have Russell Elwood, the drifter with a history of violence and questionable confessions.
It's like we're looking at two sides of the same coin, but we can't figure out which side is heads and which is tails.
It's a real head scratcher, for sure. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll dig deeper into the evidence, or lack thereof, and explore the various theories surrounding this baffling mystery. So stay with us.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Storyville Slayer case. You know, we spent the first part talking about the suspects, Victor Gant and Russell Elwood, but it's time to really roll up our sleeves and get into the nitty-gritty, the evidence, or, well, the lack of evidence in this case.
It really is like trying to assemble a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
Right, so let's start with Gant, the police officer. I mean, it's crazy to think he was a prime suspect, right? But what did they actually have on him besides, fitting that initial description and being involved with Sharon Robinson?
Well, the evidence against Gant was largely circumstantial. They couldn't definitively link him to any of the crimes.
So, no smoking gun. But what about his alibi? Was he able to account for his whereabouts during the murders? You know, that's interesting. The sources we're working with don't actually mention anything specific about Gant's alibi.
That's odd.
Yeah. But we do know that his relationship with Robinson, who was found murdered, along with her friend Karen Ivester, it definitely put him in a very compromising position.
For sure. I mean, from an investigator's perspective, how do you even approach a situation like that? A police officer connected to one of the victims? It seems like that would just complicate everything.
Oh, absolutely. It raises all sorts of red flags, like potential conflicts of interest, maybe evidence tampering, even the possibility that other officers were hesitant to really investigate one of their own.
Yeah, you have to wonder if those accusations of corruption and racketeering against Gant, could those be tied to the murders in any way?
It's definitely a possibility, but without more evidence, it's just speculation. We know he frequented those red light districts, had connections to sex workers and their pimps. So it's conceivable those connections could have played a role somehow.
Okay, so a lot of suspicions surrounding Gant, but not enough to charge him. Let's switch gears and talk about Russell Elwood. Now, he was actually convicted, right? But only for the murder of Cheryl Lewis. Why not the other murders?
Well, the conviction for Lewis's murder definitely established him as a violent individual. But there wasn't enough physical evidence to link him to any of the other crime scenes.
But if the methods were similar in many of the cases, why couldn't they connect the dots?
That's a great question. It's possible that the evidence in Lewis's case was just more compelling. Maybe they had DNA or a stronger witness testimony that directly tied Elwood to the crime.
So it's possible that the other cases just weren't as strong. We also know Elwood confessed to some of the murders, but then later recanted those confessions. What weight do those initial confessions hold, legally speaking?
Jailhouse confessions can be really tricky. They're often viewed with skepticism by the courts, and without any corroborating evidence, they're usually not enough to secure a conviction.
So it becomes a he said, she said situation with no real way to know for sure.
Exactly. And then, of course, we have that strange Clay call to the Howard Stern show.
Oh, man, that call. I mean, it's just bone-chilling to think about. Someone claiming to be the Storyville Slayer, describing the murders live on the air. It's just surreal.
It's definitely one of the most bizarre elements of this case.
Do we have any idea who Clay actually was?
Unfortunately, no. His identity remains a complete mystery. Some speculate that it could have been Elwood himself calling from prison.
But wouldn't they have been able to trace the call and confirm if it was him?
You would think so, but the details of that investigation are a bit unclear. It's possible they weren't able to conclusively determine the source of the call.
So it's another loose end in a case full of loose ends. It's
Yeah.
frustrating, right? We have these two prime suspects, Gant and Elwood, both with connections to the victims, both with a history of violence, but neither definitively linked to all of the murders.
It's like we're missing that one crucial piece of the puzzle, the one that would make everything click into place.
That's what makes cold cases like this so fascinating, but also so frustrating. Time really becomes the enemy. Memories fade, witnesses disappear, evidence degrades. It makes it so much harder to connect the dots.
It does. But that doesn't mean we should give up on seeking justice for the victims.
Absolutely not. So, what are some of the prevailing theories about what really happened? Was it Gaunt acting alone? Elwood? Or could there have been others involved?
There are a few possibilities. Some believe Gaunt or Elwood acted alone, while others suggest they might have actually worked together.
A police officer and a drifter? That seems like an unlikely pairing.
It does, doesn't it?
Right.
But we can't rule anything out. And then there's the possibility that neither of them were responsible for all of the murders, that maybe another killer or even multiple killers were operating in the same area during that time.
Multiple killers. That's a terrifying thought. But is there anything to support that theory?
Well, remember how some of the victims didn't fit the typical profile? And there were those subtle variations in the methods and disposal sites. Those discrepancies could point to the involvement of more than one perpetrator.
So, even if we entertain that theory, is it possible that Gant and Elwood could still have been involved in some of the murders? Or could they be completely innocent?
Honestly, it's impossible to say for sure with the information we have. It's a frustrating situation. We have all these possibilities, but no clear path to the truth.
It's like a giant web, and we're just trying to find the right thread to follow.
That's a great analogy. This case really highlights the complexities of forensic investigations, especially back in the 90s. You know, DNA technology was nowhere near as advanced as it is today.
And that definitely had an impact on the investigation.
Absolutely. The decomposition of the bodies, the challenges of those crime scenes, it would have been incredibly difficult to extract any usable DNA evidence. Plus, crime scene investigation protocols just weren't as sophisticated back then.
It's amazing to think about how far we've come in forensic science, but also how much we still don't know.
It really is. What do you think were some of the biggest obstacles that prevented investigators from cracking this case wide open?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to the nature of the victims themselves. Many of them were marginalized, involved in sex work, and they might have been reluctant to report crimes to the police.
That's a really important point.
Hmm.
They might have feared judgment or repercussions, which would have made it incredibly difficult for investigators to gather crucial information.
Right, and as we discussed earlier, the disposal of the bodies in waterways, that created a huge obstacle for evidence collection.
Absolutely. And the remote locations of those dumping sites made it difficult to find any witnesses or establish a solid timeline of events. And then you have the added layer of potential police corruption, with Gaunt being a suspect.
It's like a perfect storm of challenges, creating a puzzle that seems almost impossible to solve.
And yet, despite all those obstacles, there's still hope that one day we might finally get some answers. Advancements in technology, like DNA analysis and facial recognition, could potentially uncover new leads.
Do you really think there's a chance this case could be solved someday? Is new technology the key?
I think it'll take a combination of things. New technology is definitely important, but sometimes a fresh perspective can make all the difference. A new investigator with a different approach might be able to see something that was previously overlooked.
A fresh set of eyes, sometimes that's all it takes. One of the things that strikes me about this case is that it's not just about catching a killer. It also raises important questions about societal issues and the vulnerabilities of certain groups.
That's a crucial aspect of this case. These women were often overlooked and marginalized by society. Their deaths, in many ways, highlight the failures of the system to protect those who are most vulnerable.
It makes you wonder if things would have been different if they had felt safer and more empowered to come forward with information.
Absolutely. Their marginalized status likely made them less likely to report crimes or cooperate with law enforcement.
It's a stark reminder that we need to do better, to create a society where everyone feels safe and supported.
I couldn't agree more. It's about building trust and understanding, and recognizing that everyone deserves justice, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Well said. So, for now, the mystery of the Storyville Slayer continues.
It does. But the pursuit of truth never ends.
We've been digging deep into the Storyville Slayer case, examining the evidence and exploring the various theories, but I think it's important to step back for a moment and acknowledge the human element of this case.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the forensics and the investigative details, but at the end of the day, these were real people with lives and families and dreams.
Right, they weren't just names on a police report. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends, and the fact that so many of them were living on the margins of society involved in sex work, it just makes their stories even more poignant.
It does. And the lack of closure for the families, the unanswered questions that they still carry all these years later, that's a burden that we can only imagine.
It really makes you think, if these women had felt more empowered, more supported by society, if they hadn't been so marginalized, would things have been different?
That's a tough question to answer, but it's definitely worth considering, their marginalized status likely made them hesitant to engage with law enforcement, which undoubtedly hindered the investigation.
And it makes you wonder if they had felt safer, would they have been more likely to report crimes or suspicious behavior?
It's certainly possible.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
And we've also talked about how the limitations of forensic science back in the 90s, those limitations might have played a role in this case not being solved.
Absolutely. DNA technology wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today, and extracting usable DNA from decomposed bodies, especially in those conditions, would have been incredibly difficult.
So do you think it's fair to say that if this case happened today, there's a chance it could have been solved?
It's definitely possible.
Hmm.
With modern DNA analysis and crime scene investigation protocols, there's a much higher likelihood that they could have connected the dots.
It really is fascinating to see how far we've come in forensic science, but also how much we still have to learn.
So true. There's always room for improvement and innovation.
So after spending all this time with the Storyville Slayer case, what are some of the key takeaways for you?
For me, it really highlights the importance of advocating for vulnerable communities and making sure they feel safe and supported.
Right. It's about creating a society where everyone feels empowered to speak up, to report crimes, and to seek justice.
And it's about acknowledging the systemic issues that make certain groups more vulnerable to violence and exploitation.
And I think it also emphasizes the importance of continuing to push the boundaries of forensic science, to keep innovating and improving so we can solve these crimes and bring closure to the families.
Absolutely. The pursuit of justice never ends, and technology plays a crucial role in that pursuit.
Well, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the Storyville Slayer case, and unfortunately, we still don't have all the answers, but hopefully this conversation has sparked some new thoughts and maybe even inspired you to do some more digging on your own.
This case is a reminder that truth can be elusive, but that doesn't mean we should stop searching.
If you're interested in learning more about the Storyville Slayer, there are plenty of resources available online and in libraries, and we encourage you to check them out.
Keep those questions coming, keep those conversations going, and most importantly, never stop seeking the truth.
And that's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.